So as some of you, I'm sure, are aware, the Canadian government is currently looking at extending Maid, which is euthanasia in Canada, to mature minors. So that's 16 and 17-year-olds without parental consent. If that wasn't bad enough, there's a Quebec doctor who just recommended to the government that they extend euthanasia further to include infants under the age of 1. So this whack job thinks that it's okay for a parent to kill their infant up until the age of 1 years old. But here we'll go through this article and another one I found together, and I'm sure you guys will all let me know what you think in the comments about this sickening turn of events. Quebec doctor recommends infanticide under Canada's euthanasia laws. Dr. Louise Roy of the Quebec College of Physicians said that teenagers should be able to request assisted death, and babies who are born with severe deformations should also be considered for medical death to ensure they do not suffer. A Quebec doctor has directed a spotlight onto Canada's Medical Assistance in Dying (Maid) program, with his suggestion that infants under 1 year of age with severe deformations and very grave severe medical syndromes should be eligible for assisted death. In a video recording from an October 7th Maid Special Joint Committee meeting, Dr. Louis Roy of the Quebec College of Physicians said that teenagers should be able to request assisted death, and babies who are born with severe deformations should also be considered for medical death to ensure they do not suffer. Minors from 14 to 17 years of age, so nearly 18, the committee recommends, and the board of directors support as well, that these minors could, with their tutors or parents, make a request for Maid based on the level of persistent and intolerable suffering that they may experience and become unmanageable and senseless. So it's even worse than I said it looks like, because I mentioned that it was, I think, 16 and 17, and this looks like it's potentially 14 to 17 years of age for the mature minor portion. But let's just move on. Same for babies from 0 to 1 years of age who are born with severe deformations, very grave and severe medical syndromes, whose life expectancy and level of suffering are such that it would make sense to ensure that they do not suffer, given that their possibility of surviving is basically nil, he continued. Now, what's really interesting to me about this is basically nil. So he's not saying there's no chance of the baby surviving. He's just saying the chances are slim or extremely slim that the baby will survive. This doctor is truly, truly sick, but let's move on. This is something that has been used in the Netherlands as an argument, and we can explore that option, the doctor added. Here, let's listen to this clip of Dr. Louis Roy of the Quebec College of Physicians.
Third, minors from 14 to 7 years of age, nearly 18. The committee recommends, and the board of directors supports as well, that these minors could, with their tutors or parental parent, could make a request for Maid based on the level of persistent and intolerable suffering that they may experience and become unmanageable and senseless. The same for babies from 0 to 1 years of age who are born with severe deformations, very grave and severe syndromes, medical syndromes, whose life expectancy and level of suffering are such that it would make sense to ensure that they do not suffer, given that they're...
Well, there you go. Now we heard it from the sicko's mouth. The clip, having made rounds on social media, sparked outrage from online critics as well as members of the Maid Committee. Conservative MP for Alberta Edmonton, Michael Cooper, denounced Roy's testimony, saying that he was deeply disturbed. The clip, having made rounds on social media, sparked outrage from online critics as well as members of the Maid Committee. Conservative MP for St. Albert, Edmonton, Michael Cooper, denounced Roy's testimony, saying that he was deeply disturbed at the recommendation of Maid for infants who cannot consent to such a drastic procedure. It's completely wrong to suggest that Maid is appropriate for infants, which by law requires a willing patient, Cooper wrote on Twitter. The morality of euthanasia, though legal in Canada for terminally ill adults since 2016, has been highly contested since an amendment was made to allow for assisted suicide in other instances, including people struggling with mental illness. In 2021, Bill C-7 amended the original law, Bill C-14, to allow for medically assisted death. In 2021, more than 10,000 people died by euthanasia in the country. So when this bill was first introduced, it was introduced under the guise of terminally ill patients whose death was reasonably foreseeable. And it looks like in 2021 they opened it up to a whole swath of people. I think the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional, that term reasonably foreseeable. So they essentially opened it up to anyone, even if they're not going to die imminently. Just if they have any sort of condition which may lead to death. But anyways, let's get back to this article. The first Maid Joint Committee meeting was held to review the provisions of the Criminal Code with regard to the application of Bill C-7. Cooper was appointed to serve on the committee by the Conservative Party due to his extensive experience with the issue. I've been involved in sitting on the relevant committees at every stage in terms of all of the legislative steps that have been taken over the last 6 years, he said to St. Albert Today. However, the MP is still a skeptic. What we see is a disturbing number in terms of Canadians who have accessed medical assistance in dying who never did receive access to palliative care, he said. In August, the story of an armed forces veteran who sought help for his PTSD and traumatic brain injury made headlines when he was offered Maid by a Veterans Affairs Canada employee. So we can see kind of the turn that Maid or euthanasia has taken since it was first introduced into this country. And, it looks like it's very likely that by this time next year, minors, at least within a certain age group, are going to legally be able to take their own lives at a hospital without their parents' consent, which is absolutely disgusting and scary. These kids need help. They don't need doctors taking their lives. Anyways, there was a response from the Liberal government. It's encompassed in this next article I'm going to show you. And this isn't to the mature minor portion, but more towards the infants under 1 year old portion. And I'm happy to say that as of right now, at least, they're shocked by it. So this leads us to our next article right here. Federal minister says she's shocked by suggestion of assisted deaths for some babies. Thank God. So Qualtrough says she hears regularly of people with disabilities seeking death due to lack of supports. Canada's Minister of Disability Inclusion says she's offended by a Quebec doctor's suggestion that infants less than a year old should have access to medically assisted deaths if they are unlikely to survive and are dealing with severe health issues. I find that completely shocking and unacceptable. I would never support going down that road, Carla Qualtrough said in an interview with CBC Radio's The House. The idea was raised earlier this month at a parliamentary committee hearing reviewing the federal law that governs medical assistance in dying. Dr. Louis Roy of Quebec's College of Physicians said his group believes assisted death could be offered to babies up to 1 year old with severe deformities and very serious syndromes for which the chances of survival are virtually nil, and which will cause so much pain that a decision must be made to not allow the child to suffer. Well, who's making this decision exactly? The doctor who the child cannot consent to? The mother who the child cannot consent to? Or the father that the child cannot consent to? I'm not sure. Maybe it'll say lower down, but not 100% sure on that. Qualtrough, who is legally blind, said that while she can't speak on behalf of the entire government, there is no world where I would accept that. I'm genuinely happy to hear that. People often make incorrect assumptions about the quality of life that someone with a disability experiences, she said. Extending assisted death to infants is not one of the topics the parliamentary committee has been tasked with exploring, although it is reviewing whether the practice should be available to so-called mature minors who would be old enough to offer informed consent. That work was supposed to have been completed by now, but the committee has received an extension and will now have until February 17th to hand over its findings to Parliament. Qualtrough also said she hears frequently that some people with disabilities are seeking assisted deaths because they can't find adequate housing or sufficient care. And this exactly is what I'm talking about when I say that um, it's really devolved. These euthanasia laws have completely devolved from what the Liberal government said they were going to be there for at the beginning. And the Conservatives were screaming from the rooftops, warning that this was going to open doors to much more extreme uses for this, and it looks like we're there. And I'm actually worried that it's going to get worse than it currently is. Well, obviously, it looks like it definitely has the potential to, because they're looking at mature minors right now and letting them essentially choose to commit suicide, doctor assisted suicide, without parental consent. Anyways, back to this article. Working with the disability community and hearing very regularly that people's options around Maid are being driven by lack of social supports is devastating, she said. The federal government first passed a law making a doctor or nurse practitioner assisted death legal in 2016. It did so because the Supreme Court of Canada had overturned the existing ban on medically assisted death. Canadians who weren't already nearing death became eligible for Maid in 2021 when the government changed the law in response to a lower court ruling. That change allows people with grievous and irremediable medical conditions who are experiencing intolerable suffering to seek a doctor's help to die, even if their natural deaths are decades away. Qualtrough said it should not be easier to access a medically assisted death than to get a wheelchair, but it is. This is actually a stunning admission from a sitting Liberal minister that their laws and their regulations that they've passed are essentially a stunning failure. Because what could this admission actually mean other than that? Before the law changed, the federal government was warned by many disability advocates of the risk of disabled people seeking assisted deaths because inadequate supports left them feeling they had no other option. In 2020, Inclusion Canada, an organization that works on behalf of Canadians with intellectual disabilities, said that the changes were the group's worst nightmare and a moral affront. I couldn't personally agree with that more. Speaking to the House, Qualtrough said that while people can't be denied access to assisted death because they're living in poverty, she is keen to see the recommendations the parliamentary committee comes up with on improving safeguards. Again, how insane is it that a sitting Liberal minister is fully admitting that people living in poverty cannot be denied access to euthanasia? There's a requirement in the law to make sure people know of the services and supports available to them, but there's no obligation to help them access those services, and there's no obligation to provide those services, she said. Most available supports for those with disabilities are provided at the provincial level, she added. I'm very concerned about the message that people are getting from this, that somehow a life lived with a disability is worse than death, she said. It's not what I believe. So currently in Canada, euthanasia is legal if you're sick and you're about to pass away. It's legal if you're sick and you're not about to pass away. It is legal if you don't have enough money or as much as you would like and consider yourself to be in poverty. It is legal if you believe yourself to be intolerably suffering because there's no real way to prove that for the outside world in every circumstance. It is legal to be offered euthanasia if you're depressed. It is very likely going to be legal next year for 14 to 17-year-olds to be able to make this decision without parental consent. It does not look, however, that infants under the age of 1 year old will have euthanasia committed on them by doctors, at least not yet. But how long is it until the Supreme Court will rule that the mature minor law, if it does come into law, is unconstitutional and they roll that age back, how can you tell? How can you say that a 14-year-old can potentially decide to kill themselves without parental consent, but a 13-year-old cannot? What changed between 13 and 14? I do know that there's big changes in everyone's life in the younger years, but the change isn't that big that at 13 you cannot make the determination if you want to live or die, but at 14 you can. Anyways, let me know in the comments what you think about Dr. Louis Roy's suggestion that Maid be offered to babies under the age of 1. And I guess I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.